You're welcome. I want to look at risk management approach to emergency preparedness. I have more similar videos to post on this channel. Please kindly subscribe to my channel so that you can have access to more videos. Okay, so we're looking at risk management approach to emergency preparedness. In this training, we'll be looking at some definitions. Then we'll look at basics of emergency preparedness. Then we'll look at application of risk management in emergency preparedness. So let's start. We'll start with risk management. Risk management is the process of identifying vulnerabilities and threats to the information resources used by an organization in achieving business objectives and deciding what countermeasures, if any, to take in reducing risk to an acceptable level based on the value of the information resource to the organization. Now, this is one of the most comprehensive definitions of risk management I've ever seen. So we start risk management by identifying vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses, all right? Weaknesses in a system, weaknesses in a community, weaknesses in an organization, in a country that can be exploited by threats leading to losses, either business disruption, financial losses, even human life, uh, threats to human life. Then, what are threats? Threats are triggers. They are agents that can exploit vulnerabilities and lead to explosion. Okay. Then the business objectives. The business objective. We look at ISO 31000. Risk management actually starts with the business objective. That is, you cannot talk about risk management if you don't understand what you're trying to protect. So we need to know the objective of the community, the objective of the country, the objective of the business. That way, we'll be able to now identify the risks that can threaten those objectives. Then, having identified the risk, we now look at countermeasures, controls that we can use to address those risks, to reduce the risk to a level acceptable. Okay, so the acceptable level of risk is what we mean by residual risk. So we also have emergency. An emergency is a sudden, urgent, or usually unexpected occurrence or occasion requiring immediate action. So when we say we have an emergency is something that we are not really expecting. It is sudden, but the locality, the local community, business, country, they have the capacity to be able to address it. That's what differentiates emergency from disaster. Okay, so when an emergency occurs, you need to address it quickly so that it does not escalate to disaster, but you have the resources locally to contain it. Then WHO also defines what they call complex emergency. So we can have an emergency in terms of earthquake, in terms of flood, but there are certain emergencies that are initiated by hostile actions. So that is what they call complex emergency. For example, you have war going on, civil disturbance, large scale displacement of people. Even the agents that are trying to respond to the emergency could also be their own life to be at risk, as we have seen in many case studies in war-prone environments all over the world. So a disaster, according to FEMA USA, is an event that results in large numbers of deaths and injuries, causes extensive damage or destruction of facilities that provide and sustain human needs, produces an overwhelming demand on state and local response resources and mechanisms, causes a severe long-term effect on general economic activity, and severely affects state, local, and private sector capabilities to begin and sustain response activities. So according to FEMA, before you can call something a disaster, there must have been impact on human life. So that's why they brought that first. Death or injuries. In fact, many school of thought believe that before you can call an event a disaster, the human life must have been threatened. So there may be extensive damage of destruction of infrastructure. But one thing you notice is that it severely affects state, local, and private sector capabilities to begin and sustain response activities. It overwhelms the community in which that disaster happens. So we have a World Health Organization definition here. A disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of society, causing widespread human, material, or environmental losses that exceeds the local capacity to respond and calls for external assistance. So a disaster is a serious disruption that incapacitates the affected community from being able to respond locally. So they will need external assistance. And disasters are normally large scale, often across geographical, political, and academic boundaries. So you can have something happening in one country, and before you know it, three surrounding countries are already affected by that disaster. We also have displacement. Displacement is the first movement of populations of people or animals from the area where they live, usually due to sudden impact of natural disasters, threat, or conflict. So every time there's a disaster, you will see people running away from that point where the problem uh, started or spread to. So you will see people migrating from one community to the other, from one country to the other. Then we have hazard. Hazard is any source of potential harm that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihood and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. So hazard is a threat, okay, that can actually cause damage to property, that can have health impact, and increase mortality, morbidity, injury, and so on and so forth. Okay. Then we have hazard mapping, and this is where risk management now comes in. So the act of specifying and identifying locations at high risk for a specific hazard. So, for example, in Japan, tsunami and earthquake are they are quite common even as far back as ancient times, because of the geography of the area. So, uh, in Nigeria, for example, if you want to do hazard mapping, you may not be looking at earthquake, even though we had a slight tremor in the capital, in the federal capital some years back. So that's what we mean by hazard mapping. So what is this area prone to? Is it prone to flood? Is it prone to tsunami? Is it prone to earthquake, tremor? So we need to be able to know exactly what we could be expecting. Then you have human-induced disaster. So human-induced disaster is a disaster which occurs as a result of intentional or unintentional human actions, and that occurs in or close to human settlement. So human-induced disaster is a disaster that is basically initiated by human, either deliberately or innocently. For example, many wildfires have been caused by people smoking cigarettes. So after they finish smoking the cigarette, they just throw it away without actually quenching the fire properly. And you just walk away, then 3 hours, 4 hours after that, you know, you start having a wildfire that can become an emergency and even a disaster. Then you have a human impact. So human impact is the worst impact a disaster or emergency could have in terms of people dying, people getting injured, people becoming sick, people becoming ill, people becoming displaced. So that is the worst case scenario of an emergency. Then we have rapid needs assessment, a collection of techniques designed to identify quickly the basic and health needs of the community. Right, first responders are very, very important in an emergency. Okay, very, very important. So the first responders will be able to assess the situation and determine what people really need. Maybe they needed water, they need, some people may need counseling, some people may need to be moved immediately to the hospital. So first aid. So all those needs are identified during the rapid needs assessment. Then we have the vulnerability analysis. Okay, you should be able to know, especially before the emergency comes, what are you exposed to? The weaknesses or characteristics of a community or a system that can make you susceptible. For example, why is in Africa, why is emergency disaster always escalating? You know, because the level of poverty, level of literacy. So all those who affect, you know, your vulnerability and the impact of the disease, impact of the emergency or disaster on the community. So sometimes cultural belief could be a source of vulnerability. Okay, so we need to be able to in ancient Japan, because of they were prone to earthquake, they were building their houses with paper so that in case the house collapses, you know, you have limited impact on human life. But that also created another vulnerability because now when earthquake occur, even though the houses were built by with paper and people are not dying because houses were blocks of collapsed stuff, and then it gave rise it gave rise to another vulnerability which was fire. So because the houses were built with paper, anytime there was earthquake, the country was always battling with wildfires. So and that also killed a lot of people. So you need to be able to do your vulnerability analysis to know what you are exposed to. So according to Sphere Projects Handbook, these are there are indicators we can use to know when we are exposed to an emergency. For example, mortality rate has increased to greater than 1 per 10,000 people per day. 20 people, greater than 20 people are sharing one toilet. Then shelter, less than 3.5 square meters per person. Then water quality, 25% of people are down with diarrhea. Now, all these are indicators that there is an emergency. So, basics of emergency preparedness. The level of preparedness of an organization or a community will determine the impact of the emergency. Okay, so for example, in a case study in 1998 in the US, there was an ice storm in northeastern US, which knocked off power just you know, and a lot of dairy farmers could not milk their cows because they needed power to do that. But it was observed that farmers that had generators, okay, and we knew how to operate them, and generators were in good conditions, okay, they were able to contain the situation on time because they have alternative source of power. But a lot of farmers that didn't have generator or generator were in bad shape, they were not maintaining it, but there was no fuel. Those ones suffered great production losses, okay, and in some cases those cows just died. So the same experience, the same emergency, but different result because of the level of preparedness that differed. So it is very important when we are planning for emergency that we identify, we perform our risk assessment to know what we are exposed to and get ready. So let's look at the mitigation framework. We start with risk assessment. So even before the disaster strikes, like I said, you need to do a risk assessment to know what is your local disaster provenance and what are your vulnerabilities. So your vulnerabilities are internal weaknesses that can make situation worse. Okay, then the local disaster provenance, you may not have control over that. It could be geographical, right? Maybe in that area there's always tsunami. In that area there's always over storms and things like that. So you need to be able to identify the risks that the community is exposed to. Then you need to number two, ongoing development activities to combat the underlying causes of poverty. So like I said, poverty is a vulnerability. So if you have discovered in the risk assessment that there is poverty level is high, you need to We start having intervention programs in education, health and nutrition, income generation, so that the level of immunity of the community financially and literally will start rising. Okay. Then 2B, pre-catalyst litigation activities. So you do this with ongoing development activities. For example, you know that the area is prone to earthquake. You can start building earthquake resistant buildings. Okay. The area is prone to flood. You can start maybe putting up embankments and so on that can help you to minimize flood impact in that particular community. Okay. Then you move to 2C, disaster preparedness activities. For example, you can develop early warning systems. If you have done a study on crisis management, if you look at the cycle of crisis, the first stage of crisis is what? Is warning. Every crisis will always give you a warning. The warning duration will be short. Uh, Before the crisis strikes, it can be lengthy. But a lot of time you know that the problem is coming. So you need to be able to have a system in place. You can even use technology. Now we have AI, we have artificial intelligence, robotics, data analytics. So you can be able to gather information that will be able to help us to be able to know when we may likely have a disaster or an emergency. We can also start talking of food. We can start having a food reserve, medicine reserve, right? Preparing emergency shelters and so on. Development of emergency response procedures. So if there's fire, what do we do? If there's flood, what do we do? If there's communal crisis, what do we do? All these things must be done prior to the emergency. Then we have the onset of catalyst. So now the trigger has occurred. We have a monsoon, hurricane, earthquake, fire, whatever level of emergency. Then the emergency maybe comes in a very large scale. It can become a disaster, all right? But the good thing about it, because we have already prepared, the impact of the disaster will be less in terms of the number of people that will be injured, the number of people that will die, the number of people that we need to remove. Okay, so because of the readiness, the impact of the disaster is minimized. Okay, then we have emergency relief. Okay, so we need, based on the assessment, we talk about the needs assessment. So people, experts, will need to come to the ground to see what the people really need, the level of response that is required at that particular time. So we have emergency relief. Then from there, we now move to the rehabilitation and reconstruction activities. So giving the lives of the people back to them. So they build back their house, they establish social networks, and so on. So here notes, the more effective mitigation activities are, the less emergency relief and rehabilitation are required. So once we have done 1 to 4, right, then step 5 to 6 become easier for us. That is what we mean. So the more prepared you are, the less you have to run around when there is an emergency or crisis. So let's look at it also in this form. Risk-based emergency preparedness involves 3 basic steps. You need to know your risk, you need to make a plan, then you need to create an emergency kit. So knowing the risk is very, very important, like I said, in emergency preparedness, either you want to do for your organization, or for a community, or for a country, or for a local government, you need to know the disasters you are prone to. For example, in Canada, there was a case study, Prince Edward Island. So people did the hazard map, they discovered that the island is exposed to hurricanes, blizzards, ice storms, forest fires, right, flooding and storm surges in coastal areas. So they'll be able to identify that. So you know the risk. In Lagos, Nigeria, for example, you have fires in offices, in markets. You have boat mishaps happening. You have tanker accidents, explosions because of the tanker that are carrying petrol. You have area boys clashes here and there. You have flooding, especially in Lekki side. Then you have container falling. So why I put all these emergencies here is because anybody that wants to to develop emergency preparedness plan for Lagos, you must be aware of all these emergencies that have happened before in the history of Lagos. So you start now planning for how you can address those emergencies. So, for example, look at Lagos. That is during the rainy season, there is always a challenge of flood. Look at some of the banks uh, having a fire incident. Then you have the boat mishaps that has happened several times because of people traveling over water. Then you have the fuel tanker accident that happened some years ago, and a lot of people died in that emergency. Then you have containers falling on vehicles, falling on vehicles. Those are sad incidents that the states need to really address urgently. So then you have cases of monile. You know, monile are the children of landowners. So in Lagos, you buy land, then you want to build. So somebody will come and say, before you do foundation, you pay us. Right, before you do you roof, you pay us. Before you can paint, you pay us. Before you can move in, you pay us. So this leads to crisis, has led to crisis in so many parts of Lagos and even sometimes results in the loss of human life. So I just gave this as an experience of what um, is happening in Lagos. So if you want to do emergency preparedness plan for Lagos, you need to be able to be aware of these risks. So the same thing, if you want to do that for your community, your state, your country, your company, you need to have a team, a cross-functional team to sit down and be able to identify the risks that the community is exposed to. So we can also have emergency probability ranking. So it's not just enough to identify the risk. You need to know the type of risk that it is. You need to determine the probability. How likely is it that the risk will crystallize? You need to be able to rank the risk, right? Impact on human life, impact on property, impact of the business. And like I said any risk that will affect human life should be your priority. All right, what resources do you have available for the situation? So the higher the risk, the greater your commitment in terms of emergency preparedness. Okay, so now that you have understood the risk, you need to now start making an emergency preparedness plan. So the plan will address identification of potential emergency scenarios, what will go wrong, emergency incident classification, how do we classify, how do we rank, emergency response organization and responsibilities, who is responsible for what, who are the first aid guy, who are the first responders. So we need to be able to identify those. Coordination with external governmental emergency response organization. Very important. You need to key in with NEMA, key with the fire services, the police, even the maybe the local community leaders, and so on and so forth. So it's very important that we key in with all these emergency response organization. So we need to have an emergency alarms and communication systems. So how do we communicate? Is it via email? Is it via phone? Is it via public address system? Is it on radio, social media? So we need to have a proven system. Then emergency response procedures should be detailed, very detailed, documented, and tested. The emergency and media communication procedures, not everybody should speak in an emergency. The organization must have people, communication specialists that have been trained and who knows and what to say when an emergency strikes. We have case studies of people misfiring and causing more problems, more agitation when they say the wrong thing in an emergency. And in an emergency, you can't speak offhand. When you are meeting with people, the government, you are meeting with the media guys, you need to have a pre-written memo so that your legal guys, your communication guys will review it to make sure that you are not going to misfire. Then we need to have evacuation procedures. If there's a need to evacuate people, We need to have that also detailed. Then emergency response equipment need to be procured before the disaster. Then post emergency recovery. How do we get back our lives at the end of the emergency? Then we need to also have emergency preparedness inspections. So a team should draw up the emergency preparedness plan. The team should implement it, and if possible, another team should now review the entire process. So for independence and objectivity, there is need for proper training and drills. So the drills are very, very important because they will expose the readiness of the team for the emergency. Then the plan must be continuously reviewed, maintained, and controlled. So you need to be able to be doing at least annually when there's a trigger, go over the plan again and see whether there's a need for updates. So now that you already have an emergency preparedness plan, you need to create an emergency kit. Okay, so you need to have in your kit backpacks, flashlights, multi-tool, first aid kit, hand crank radios, matches and lighters, power bank, batteries, sleeping bag, warm blanket, deck of cards to while away time, food, water, whistle, solar cooker. So all these are uh, resources you expect to have in your emergency kit. Thank you. So once again, as I said, please uh, subscribe to my channel for more educative videos like this. Thank you.